In the 1950s, a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin wanted to answer a question that science had been afraid to ask directly. What if you could remove one thing from a child's life? Not food, not shelter, not safety. What if you removed love? Not the idea of love, not the concept, but the actual physical experience of it. Touch, affection, the warmth of another living thing. Would a child survive? And if they did, what would they become? To find out, he didn't use children. He used monkeys. But what he discovered was so disturbing, so fundamentally true about what we are as human beings, that scientists spent the next 70 years trying to unsee it. They couldn't, and neither will you. The man's name was Harry Harlow. He was a primatologist, a scientist who studied monkeys, and he worked at a time when psychology was obsessed with a very particular theory about how children grow up. The theory was called behaviorism, and it said something radical, that love was not necessary, not really, not biologically. Behaviorists believed that if you fed a child, kept them clean, and provided shelter, they would thrive. Love, affection, comfort, these were luxuries. Nice to have, maybe, but not essential. Mothers were incubators, caretakers, functions. A child didn't need a mother's embrace. A child needed calories and a dry diaper. This wasn't fringe thinking, this was mainstream psychology. In the 1920s and 30s, parenting advice books told mothers to resist the urge to hold their babies. Don't coddle them, the experts said. Avoid excessive affection. It will make them weak. Some hospitals instructed nurses never to pick up crying infants. Let them cry. Let them learn. The belief was so strong, so deeply embedded in the culture, that it shaped policy. It shaped how orphanages operated. It shaped how institutions cared for children who had no one else. The suffering was invisible because no one was looking for it. Harry Harlow decided to test the theory directly. He wanted to prove or disprove whether love mattered at all. He bred rhesus monkeys in his laboratory and separated newborns from their mothers within hours of birth. This was the beginning of what would become one of the most famous and most troubling experiments in the history of science. He took these baby monkeys and he placed them in cages. The cages were not cruel by the standards of the time. They were clean, temperature-controlled, sanitary. The monkeys had everything a behaviorist said they needed. Everything except a mother. Instead of a mother, Harlow gave them two artificial mothers, two wireframe structures about the size of a real monkey. One was made of bare wire, the other was wrapped in soft terry cloth. This was the elegant cruelty of the experiment. One mother could give food, the other could give comfort, but not both. The baby monkeys had to choose. The results were immediate and devastating. The baby monkeys went to the wire mother when they were hungry. They would feed frantically, taking what they needed, but the moment they were full, they would abandon her. They would climb onto the cloth mother. They would cling to her for hours. They would touch her, wrap around her, press their faces against the fabric, and when they were frightened, when Harlow introduced a loud noise or a moving object into the cage, they didn't run to the source of food. They ran to the cloth. They ran to softness. They ran to comfort, even though comfort had never fed them. Harlow watched this happen, and he understood that he had just demolished the behaviorist theory with two pieces of wire and some fabric. Love wasn't a luxury, it was fundamental. It was biological. A baby monkey would choose comfort over food. A baby monkey would rather starve slowly while holding something soft than eat while alone. But here is where the experiment takes a turn toward the truly dark. The monkeys who were raised with only the cloth mother, who got comfort but inadequate nutrition, they survived, but they didn't develop normally. They didn't play, they didn't explore. They sat in their cages, rocking back and forth, holding the cloth mother, unable to move forward into the world. And the monkeys raised with only the wire mother, who got fed but never touched, never comforted, they developed in even more disturbing ways. They would rock. They would hit themselves. They would pull out their own fur in patches. Some of them developed a condition that looked almost like autism. They would stare blankly, make repetitive motions, seem almost not present in their own bodies. But the most heartbreaking discovery came when Harlow tried to rehabilitate these monkeys. He took the severely isolated monkeys, the ones raised in total loneliness, not even wire or cloth mothers, just walls and bars, and he tried to reintroduce them to normal monkey society. He thought that at some point, with enough time and exposure, they would learn to be monkeys again. They didn't. The isolated monkeys couldn't interact with other monkeys. They didn't know how to play. They didn't understand social cues. When other monkeys approached them with friendliness, the isolated ones became violent or catatonic. They had missed something that couldn't be recovered. There was a window in which love had to happen. And when that window closed, something in them closed too. Harlow didn't say it this way in his papers, but what he had discovered was this. You can raise a body in isolation. You can keep it breathing. You can keep it alive. But something else stops. Something about being a self stops. For decades, Harlow's work stayed in the laboratory. Psychologists read his papers. They understood the implications. And they did almost nothing because the implications were too massive. They were too indicting. If love wasn't a luxury, if it was biological, essential, wired into our brains, then every orphanage in the world that operated on the old behaviorist model was committing a form of psychological abuse. Every mother who had been told not to coddle her baby had been following bad science. Every institution that kept children fed but unloved had been creating the conditions for psychological damage that might never heal. It was easier to keep the experiments in the laboratory. But the experiments didn't stay in the laboratory. They happened anyway, in the real world, in places where no one was looking to measure the damage. In the 1960s and 70s, researchers finally started investigating orphanages and institutions for children who had been separated from their parents. What they found matched Harlow's monkeys almost exactly. Children in institutions where they were fed and kept clean but rarely held or played with, these children didn't develop normally. They showed what psychiatrists called reactive attachment disorder. They couldn't form bonds. They couldn't trust. Some of them seemed almost not present, moving through the world but not connecting to it. But there was one case that brought this home in a way that pure research never could. In the 1980s, after the fall of Ceausescu in Romania, the world discovered something that had been hidden for decades. Romania had thousands of orphanages. Children had been warehoused in these institutions by the thousands. They were fed, they were kept alive, but they were touched almost never, held almost never. The orphanages operated on a scale so vast and so understaffed that one caretaker might be responsible for 30 infants. There was no time for love. When Western aid workers and journalists finally got inside these orphanages, they found children who looked like they had suffered severe trauma or neurological damage. But many of these children were medically healthy. The damage was to something else, to something that couldn't show up on an X-ray. Some of the children who were adopted out, who were taken into homes where they were finally held and loved, they recovered, slowly, over years. Their brains rewired themselves. They learned to connect. They learned to be present. But many of them never fully recovered. The window had closed. The isolation had happened during the period when their brains were most plastic, most ready to learn how to be human, and they had missed it. Harlow's monkeys had given us the prophecy. The Romanian orphans were the fulfillment of it. Now, you might think the science is settled. You might think that after Harlow, after the orphanage discoveries, everyone understands that love is essential. But here's what's strange. The science got settled, but the practices didn't always change. Even today, children in institutions around the world are raised in conditions that approximate what Harlow's isolated monkeys experienced. Not because people are cruel, but because the world is large, resources are scarce. And touching, real, consistent, loving touch is labor-intensive. It takes time. It takes presence. You can't automate it. And there's something else. Something that makes this even more complicated. Harlow showed us that love is biologically necessary, but he didn't fully explain why. Why does touch matter so much? Why can't you just have food and shelter and survive emotionally intact? The answer has to do with something called felt safety. When a baby, monkey or human, is held, when they feel the heartbeat of another living thing, when they experience physical warmth and contact, something happens in their nervous system. It tells them you are safe, you are not alone. The world contains comfort. This isn't psychological. It's neurological. Touch activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It lowers cortisol. It releases oxytocin. It rewires how the brain processes threat and safety. Without that experience in the critical window, a child's brain gets stuck in a different mode. Hypervigilant, defensive, unable to fully relax into connection because they have never learned that connection is safe. This is what Harlow's isolated monkeys didn't have. Not the food, not the shelter, the experience of being held by something that wanted to hold them back. And here's the thing that makes this even darker. The isolation doesn't have to be physical. You can grow up in a house with people around you and still experience emotional isolation. You can have a roof and food and clothing and parents who simply don't touch you, don't affirm you, don't pour love over you the way Frederick II's nurses were forbidden to pour love over those babies. The effects are the same. In Harlow's language, something inside you stops. Harlow died in 1981, troubled by what his work had revealed. He had wanted to prove that behaviorism was wrong. He had succeeded. But in proving that love was essential, he he had also revealed something harder to bear, that there were thousands, millions of children growing up without it, and that some of that damage couldn't be undone. The question Harlow set out to answer was, do children need love, or is that just something we tell ourselves? The answer turned out to be more complicated and more true than anyone wanted to hear. Children don't just need love, they need to feel loved through their bodies, through touch, through presence, through being held by someone who wants to hold them. This isn't poetic, this is biology. This is how brains develop. This is how nervous systems learn to regulate. This is how the sense of self gets built in the first place. You are not born with the ability to feel safe in your own skin. You are not born knowing that you matter. You are not born understanding that you are worthy of love. These things are taught to you through every touch, every word, every moment someone chooses to be present with you instead of turning away. Harlow's monkeys never learned these things, and something in them, something fundamental, never developed. And here is where it gets even more profound. Harlow thought he was testing whether love was necessary for survival. What he actually discovered was that love is necessary for being, for becoming a self, for developing the capacity to connect, to grow, to move through the world as something other than a frightened, reactive creature. You can have a functioning body without love, but you cannot become a person without it. Frederick II, the emperor from 800 years earlier, had tried to find the original language of humanity by raising babies in silence. What he discovered, what he didn't understand, he'd discovered, was that silence kills something essential. Harry Harlow, 750 years later, tried to remove love from the equation. What he discovered was the same thing, just measured differently. You can keep a body alive. You can even keep it breathing. But without love, without touch, without the experience of mattering to someone else, the person never quite shows up. We are not born knowing how to love ourselves. We learn it from being loved. We are not born understanding our own worth. We learn it from being held like we matter. And if no one teaches us these things in that critical window, when our brains are most open, most plastic, most ready to learn what it means to be human, then something in us stays locked in that cage, rocking, waiting for a touch that never comes. We are not born human. We are held into being.